Rain tapped softly against the window that night. Not the kind of storm that shakes the roof, but the quiet, steady kind that makes the whole neighborhood feel wrapped in a blanket. Inside a small house on the edge of town, a 12-year-old boy sat on the couch with a worn-out sketchbook in his lap. He wasn't drawing anything fancy, just lines, shapes, the curve of a street lamp he'd seen on his walk home from school. His little sister was asleep down the hall, and his mom was working the late shift again, so the house felt both peaceful and a little too quiet. Outside, crickets hummed. A car passed by, its headlights sweeping across the living room wall like a slow-moving spotlight. The boy barely noticed. He liked these moments when the world slowed down enough for him to think. He'd always been the kind of kid who watched more than he spoke. Not shy exactly, just careful. He paid attention to things others missed. The way someone's voice cracked when they were lying, how shadows stretched longer on cloudy days, or how a dog's ears twitched before its owner even called its name. Then, out of nowhere, sirens cut through the calm. At first, he thought it was just another patrol car heading downtown, but the sound grew louder, sharper, and then stopped, right near the corner of Maple and 5th. That was only 2 blocks away. He got up and walked to the front door, peering through the glass. Red and blue lights pulsed against the wet pavement, painting the trees in flashes of color. 2 police cruisers were parked crookedly near the sidewalk. A few neighbors had come out onto their porches, arms crossed, faces tight with worry. He didn't plan to go any closer, but something pulled him forward. Maybe curiosity, maybe that quiet sense that something wasn't right. He slipped on his sneakers, left the door unlocked behind him, and walked slowly toward the commotion, staying in the shadows where streetlights didn't reach. What he saw next would stay with him forever. An officer stood over a man who was on the ground, not moving. Another officer was speaking into a radio, voice low and urgent. Rain dripped off their hats. The boy froze behind a parked van, heart pounding. He couldn't hear the words, but he saw the way the officer on the left reached into his belt. Not for handcuffs, but for something else. Then, in one quick motion, the officer dropped an object near the man's outstretched hand. It clinked against the wet concrete. The boy squinted. It looked like a small black handgun, but here's what didn't make sense. The man on the ground hadn't moved since the boy arrived. His arms were limp. His eyes were closed. And yet seconds later, the officer stepped back and said something to his partner. Something that made them both nod like everything was under control. Within minutes, more cars arrived, paramedics, detectives. Yellow tape went up. People were told to go back inside. The boy slipped away before anyone noticed him, his mind racing faster than his feet. The next morning, the local news called it a tragic but justified incident. They said the man had threatened officers with a weapon, that he'd refused to drop it, that the officer had acted in self-defense. There was even a short clip of the police chief praising the responding team for their quick thinking and bravery. But the boy sat at the kitchen table, cereal untouched, staring at the screen. Because what he'd seen didn't match what they were saying. Not even close. He didn't tell anyone at first. Who would believe a kid? He tried to push it out of his mind, focused on school, helped his sister with her homework, even laughed at a dumb joke his friend made during lunch. But at night he'd lie awake, replaying the scene over and over. The way the officer's shoulders tensed before he dropped the gun, the unnatural stillness of the man on the ground, the silence that followed, thicker than the rain. A week later he started drawing again. Not street lamps this time. He sketched the alleyway, the angle of the cruisers, the position of the bodies. He drew the officer's uniform, the badge number he'd glimpsed, even the brand of shoe the man on the ground had been wearing. One lace untied. It wasn't because he wanted to be a detective. It was because if he didn't put it down on paper, he was afraid he'd forget, or worse, convince himself he'd imagined it. His teacher noticed the change. He used to raise his hand all the time, full of questions about space or history or how bridges stayed up. Now he stared out the window during lessons, pencil tapping nervously against his desk. One afternoon after class, she asked if everything was okay at home. He almost said yes. But something in her voice, the real concern, not just the polite kind, made him hesitate. "I saw something," he whispered. "Something I shouldn't have." She didn't interrupt, didn't laugh, just listened. When he finished describing what happened that night, she didn't promise to fix it. She didn't call the police right then and there. Instead, she said, "Truth matters no matter who speaks it. Even if you're 12. especially if you're 12. The next day, she connected his mom with a legal aid group that helped people who couldn't afford lawyers. His mom was scared of getting involved, scared of what might happen if they challenged the police. But she looked at her son, really looked at him, and saw the weight he'd been carrying alone. So she took a deep breath and made the call. At first, the adults were polite but doubtful. Kids misremember things, one investigator said gently. Stress can twist details. But then they asked him questions, specific ones, about the direction the cars were facing, the color of the man's jacket, whether the officer used his left or right hand, and every time the boy answered without hesitation. His answers matched evidence they hadn't released to the public. That's when their tone changed. That's when they started taking notes. Real notes, not just the kind you write to be kind. Still, no one expected much to happen. Police investigations don't usually get reopened because of a child's sketchbook. But then something unexpected occurred. A retired detective volunteering with the legal aid group reviewed the case file. He noticed a gap in the timeline, a missing 6 seconds in the body cam footage. And when he compared it to the boy's drawings, the pieces started to fit in a way that made his stomach drop. Word began to spread, not loudly, not on the news, but in hushed conversations between lawyers, community leaders, and a few brave journalists. People started asking questions, not angry ones, just honest ones, like, if the man already had a gun, why did the officer need to drop one near him? And why does the official report say the man was standing when every witness says he was on the ground? The boy didn't know any of this yet. He was just trying to get through his math homework and remember to feed the neighbor's cat while they were on vacation. But deep down he felt it, the shift, like the air before a thunderstorm. Something was coming. He didn't want to be famous. He didn't want revenge. He just wanted the truth to be seen. Because if no one spoke up, then what happened that rainy night would disappear into paperwork and press releases, and the man on the ground would become just another name no one remembered, and maybe worse, people would stop believing that kids could see clearly when adults looked away. So, when the letter came in the mail, a formal request for him to testify, he didn't flinch. He folded it carefully, put it in his sketchbook, and went outside to watch the sunset. The sky was orange and pink, quiet again, but this time the quiet felt different. Not empty, full of possibility, because sometimes the smallest voice is the one that changes everything. Weeks passed, but the quiet in the house never really came back. It wasn't loud, no shouting, no slamming doors, but there was a kind of stillness that felt heavy, like the air before a storm that never quite breaks. The boy sat at the kitchen table most evenings, sketching the same scene over and over, the alley, the flashing lights, the officer's stance. Each drawing was a little sharper, a little more detailed, as if his hands were trying to catch what his mind couldn't let go of. His mom watched him from the corner of her eye while she washed dishes or folded laundry. She didn't say much, but he could tell she was worried. Not just about the case, though that was enough, but about him. About the way he jumped when a siren passed by. About how he stopped humming while he did his homework, like he used to. She'd tried once to talk to him about it, gently, over pancakes on a Sunday morning. "You don't have to carry this alone," she'd said. He'd nodded, but didn't say anything back. Not because he didn't want to, but because he wasn't sure anyone could really understand what it felt like to see something no one else believed. At school, things changed too. He wasn't the center of attention. Kids didn't whisper behind his back or point at him in the hallway, but he felt different, like he was walking through the world with a secret too big for his pockets. His best friend asked him once if he was okay, and he just shrugged and said, "Yeah, just tired," which wasn't a lie. He was tired. Tired of replaying that night. Tired of wondering if he should have stayed inside. Tired of feeling like the only one who saw what really happened. But then came the day everything shifted. It started with a knock on the door after dinner. Not the kind of knock that means trouble, sharp and urgent, but a soft, polite tap. His mom opened it to find a woman in a simple gray coat, holding a folder and a warm smile. She introduced herself as someone who worked with the legal aid group and asked if they could talk for a few minutes. His mom hesitated, then nodded and invited her in. The woman didn't sit right away. She looked around the living room, the family photos on the wall, The stack of library books on the coffee table, the half-finished puzzle on the floor, and seemed to take it all in like she was trying to understand them just by being in their space. Then she turned to the boy and said, "I've seen your drawings." He froze, pencil halfway through sketching a street sign. "They're very accurate," she continued, her voice calm, like she was talking about the weather. "More accurate than some official reports I've read." He didn't know what to say, so he just looked down at his paper. She sat across from him and opened her folder. Inside were photos from the scene, the alley, the position of the cars, the spot where the man had lain. "Can you tell me what's missing here?" she asked. He glanced at the photos, then back at his sketchbook. Without thinking, he pointed. The trash can was tipped over, and there was a soda can near the curb, green one, half full. He paused. Also, the officer's radio was on his left shoulder, not the right. She didn't react right away, just made a small note. Then she asked, "And the gun? Where did you see it fall?" He swallowed. After the man was already down. The officer dropped it near his right hand, like he was placing it there. She looked at him for a long moment, not with disbelief, not with pity, but with something closer to respect. "Thank you," she said quietly. "That helps more than you know." After she left, the house felt lighter, like a window had been cracked open. His mom sat beside him on the couch and put an arm around his shoulders. "You did the right thing," she said, "even if it's hard." But the real test came a few days later. A detective, retired, but still sharp-eyed, came to visit. He didn't wear a uniform, just a button-down shirt and jeans, and he brought a bag of donuts for the road. He talked to the boy like he was talking to another adult, asking clear, careful questions. No tricks, no pressure, just facts. "Walk me through it again," he said, "from the moment you stepped outside." And the boy did, step by step, word for word. He described the angle of the rain, the sound of boots on wet pavement, the way the officer's voice sounded when he said something to his partner, low, almost like a warning. The detective listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, eyes never leaving the boy's face. When he was done, the detective leaned back and said, "You've got a good memory. A rare one." Then he added, "But memory isn't enough. We need proof." That's when they showed him the body cam footage, just a short clip carefully edited to protect privacy. It was grainy, shaky, and cut off right before the critical moment. But even in that blur, the boy noticed something. The officer's hand moved toward his belt after the man was on the ground, not before. "That's not how it's supposed to happen," the detective said quietly. From that point on, things moved faster. Lawyers started calling. Meetings were scheduled. His mom had to take time off work, and they sat in small rooms with people who spoke in careful words like credibility, chain of evidence, and judicial review. The boy didn't understand all of it, but he understood this. They were starting to believe him. Still, not everyone did. One afternoon, while waiting outside a lawyer's office, he overheard two men talking in the hallway. "A 12-year-old?" one said, voice dripping with doubt. "Kids make things up, especially when they want attention." His stomach dropped. He didn't say anything, just stared at his shoes and gripped the strap of his backpack tighter. But later that night, his mom found him sitting on the back porch, staring at the stars. She sat beside him and said, "You don't need them to believe you. You just need to know you're telling the truth." He nodded, but it still hurt. Then came the turning point. The legal team discovered something the police report had left out. A neighbor's security camera had caught part of the incident from a different angle. The footage was fuzzy, but it clearly showed the officer bending down after the man was motionless and placing something near his hand. When they compared it to the boy's sketches, the match was undeniable. Suddenly, the case wasn't just about a kid's word anymore. It was about evidence, about contradictions, about questions that couldn't be ignored. The district attorney agreed to reopen the investigation. The news didn't make headlines, not yet, but in certain circles, people started paying attention. Community leaders reached out. A local journalist asked for an interview, His mom said no, but thanked them. And for the first time, the boy felt like he wasn't shouting into the wind. He still had nightmares sometimes, still flinched at sudden noises. But now, when he drew, it didn't feel like he was trying to hold on to something slipping away. It felt like he was building something, piece by piece, truth by truth. One evening, his little sister came into his room holding a crayon drawing of her own. It showed a boy standing in front of a big building pointing at someone in a uniform. Above it, in wobbly letters, she'd written, "My brother is brave." He tacked it to his wall, right next to his sketches. He wasn't sure what would happen next. Courtrooms, lawyers, judges, it all felt like a world away from his bedroom and his school and his bike parked by the garage. But he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to stay silent. Because silence, he'd learned, was how the truth got buried. And he wasn't ready to let that happen. Document, Part 3, 1400 words. The morning of the court date arrived with a strange kind of quiet. Not the peaceful kind that comes with early sunrises and birds chirping, but the kind that feels like the whole world is holding its breath. The boy stood in front of the bathroom mirror, adjusting the collar of his button-down shirt. His mom's idea, not his. He'd never worn a shirt this stiff before. It scratched his neck and made him feel like he was playing dress-up in someone else's life. His little sister peeked in, still in pajamas, holding a half-eaten piece of toast. "You look like a lawyer," she said, crumbs tumbling onto the floor. He almost smiled. "Lawyers don't wear sneakers," he said, glancing down at his well-worn pair, the ones with the frayed laces he kept meaning to replace. "They do if they're cool lawyers," she replied. As if it were obvious, his mom appeared in the doorway holding 2 mugs of hot chocolate. "You ready?" she asked, her voice steady, but her eyes gave her away. They were wide, a little glassy, like she'd been up most of the night worrying. He took a deep breath. "As I'll ever be." The courthouse wasn't like it was on TV. No dramatic music, no shouting matches between lawyers, no sudden gasps from a packed gallery. It was just big. Cold marble floors, high ceilings that echoed every footstep, and long hallways lined with doors that all looked the same. People moved quickly, speaking in hushed tones, clutching folders and coffee cups like shields. The boy kept close to his mom, eyes scanning everything, the security guards, the signs on the walls, the way sunlight streamed through tall windows and landed in sharp rectangles on the floor. They were met by the legal team just outside the courtroom. The woman from the legal aid group gave him a small, reassuring nod. The retired detective was there too, standing near the back like a quiet guardian. No one said much. There wasn't much to say. They all knew what was at stake. Inside, the room was smaller than he expected. Wooden benches, a raised bench for the judge, a long table for the prosecutors, another for the defense. And in the middle, a simple chair with a microphone. His chair. He sat beside his mom in the front row, hands folded in his lap, trying to slow his heartbeat. He watched as people filed in, reporters with notepads, city officials in suits, a few neighbors he recognized from the block. Then the officers walked in. His stomach tightened. There he was, the officer from that night. Older now in person, with tired eyes and a stiff posture. He didn't look at the boy. Didn't even glance in his direction. He just sat down, arms crossed, jaw set, like he was bracing for something he already knew was coming. The judge entered. Everyone stood. The room fell silent. The trial began with dry, technical language, motions, objections, procedural updates. The boy didn't understand half of it, but he listened anyway, trying to catch every word. He noticed how the defense attorney kept glancing his way, like he was sizing him up, like he was already planning how to make him look small. Confused, unreliable, when the prosecutor finally said, "We call the witness," the boy's legs felt like they might give out. He walked to the stand slowly, each step echoing in the quiet room. He placed his hand on the Bible, repeated the oath in a voice quieter than he meant to, and sat down. The microphone loomed in front of him like a giant insect. The prosecutor started gently. "Can you tell us your name and how old you are?" He did. "And where were you on the night of October 17th? He described his house, the rain, the sirens. His voice grew steadier as he spoke, like he was telling a story he'd practiced 100 times, which in a way he had. What did you see when you went outside? He took a breath. Then he told them. Everything. The alley, the lights, the man on the ground, the officer dropping the object. He didn't add drama, didn't raise his voice. Just stated what he saw as clearly as he could. The prosecutor nodded. Thank you. Then came the defense attorney. He stood slowly, adjusted his tie, and walked toward the witness stand with a calm, almost friendly smile. You're 12 years old, correct? Yes. And you were alone that night? No adults with you? Yes. You weren't supposed to be outside, were you? I just wanted to see what was happening. So you were curious. Maybe even a little scared? I was worried. The lawyer nodded like that proved something. And you're saying you saw all of this from behind a parked van? In the rain, at night? Is that right? Yes. From how far away? About 30 feet. And it was dark, wet, chaotic. Yet you remember exact details, the officer's badge number, the brand of the man's shoes, which hand held the radio. That's quite a memory for someone your age. The boy didn't flinch. I pay attention. The lawyer's smile didn't reach his eyes. Of course you do. But isn't it possible, just possible, that your mind filled in some gaps later? After hearing news reports? After talking to adults who had strong opinions? No, the boy said. I drew what I saw that same night. Before I heard anything on the news. A murmur rippled through the room. The lawyer paused, then changed tactics. You like to draw, don't you? You've shown us many sketches. Very detailed. Almost like a story you created. They're not stories, the boy said, voice firmer now. They're what happened. But drawings aren't evidence, are they? They're just pictures. They match the security footage, the boy replied. And the photos from the scene, the lawyer blinked. He hadn't expected that. The judge cleared his throat. Counsel, stick to the facts. The questioning went on for another 20 minutes, probing, testing, trying to find a crack. But the boy stayed steady. He corrected small mistakes. It was the left cruiser, not the right. Clarified timing. The officer dropped the object after the man stopped moving, and never once contradicted himself. When he finally stepped down from the stand, his legs were shaking, but not from fear. From relief. He'd done it. He'd said it all, right there in front of everyone, and he hadn't backed down. His mom squeezed his hand as he sat back down. Her eyes were wet, but she was smiling. Then came the moment no one saw coming. During a break, as people milled about and lawyers whispered in corners, the boy looked up and saw the officer watching him. Not with anger, not with denial, but with something else, something like recognition. The boy didn't look away, and in that silent exchange, something shifted in the room. It wasn't proof. It wasn't a confession, but it was real. Human. And sometimes that's what cuts through the noise more than any legal argument ever could. When court resumed, the prosecutor stood and said, Your Honor, we'd like to enter into evidence the witness's original sketches, dated the night of the incident, along with time-stamped security footage from a neighboring property. The defense objected, but weakly. The judge allowed it. As the sketches were passed around, even the defense attorney took a long look. One showed the exact angle of the officer's arm as he bent down. Another captured the reflection of the cruiser lights in a puddle, details no child should have known unless they were really there. People started whispering again. Not loud, just enough to fill the air with a new kind of tension. The boy didn't say another word that day. He didn't need to, because sometimes the truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs to be seen. And for the first time in a room full of adults who thought they knew better, a 12-year-old boy had made sure it was. The courtroom felt different the next day. It wasn't just the people or the light or even the air, it was the weight of what was coming. Everyone knew the boy would be called back to the stand. Not for more questions, but for something bigger, something final. He sat in the same front row seat, hands resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the floor. His mom sat beside him, quiet but close, her presence like an anchor. He didn't feel scared, not exactly. More like ready, like he'd been walking toward this moment since that rainy night, and now there was no turning back. The judge entered. The room stood. The usual formalities passed in a blur. Then the prosecutor stood, adjusted his papers, and said, Your Honor, we'd like to recall the witness. The boy rose slowly. His shoes made soft clicks against the polished floor. He walked to the stand again, sat down, placed his hands in his lap. The microphone stood inches from his chin, waiting. This time the prosecutor didn't ask about the rain or the alley or the sketches. He went straight to the heart of it. Do you see the officer involved in the incident that night in this courtroom today? The boy didn't answer right away. He looked up, really looked, scanning the room. His eyes passed over lawyers, reporters, city officials, even the judge. Then they landed on him. The officer sat at the defense table, shoulders squared, face unreadable. He didn't avoid the boy's gaze this time. Maybe he couldn't, maybe he knew what was coming. The boy took a breath. Yes, he said. Can you point him out for the court? A hush fell over the room so deep you could hear the hum of the lights overhead. The boy lifted his hand, slowly, steadily, and pointed directly at the officer. That's him. The words hung in the air like a stone dropped in still water. Ripples spread instantly. A sharp intake of breath from the gallery. A reporter's pen froze mid-sentence. Even the judge seemed to lean forward slightly. But it wasn't just the pointing that stunned them. It was what came next. The prosecutor asked, "What did you see this officer do that night?" And the boy said, clear as morning light, he dropped the gun after the man was already on the ground. Silence. Not the polite kind. Not the courtroom kind. This was the kind of silence that comes when something true cuts through years of noise. People shifted in their seats. Someone coughed. A bailiff glanced toward the door as if expecting something to happen. The defense attorney shot to his feet. Objection. That's not what the official report says. The witness is speculating. The judge didn't rule right away. He looked at the boy. Do you know for certain that the object was a gun? I saw it, the boy said. It was black, small, with a grip. The officer picked it up from his belt and put it near the man's hand after he stopped moving. And how do you know the man had already stopped moving? Because his eyes were closed. His arms were flat on the ground. He didn't make a sound, not even when the rain hit his face. A woman in the back row covered her mouth with her hand. The prosecutor turned to the judge. Your Honor, we'd like to play the newly recovered footage from the neighbor's camera, time-stamped 10:47, which shows the officer bending over the motionless individual and placing an object near his right hand. The defense objected again, but this time, his voice lacked its usual confidence. The judge nodded. Play it, the screen flickered to life. Grainy, shaky, but unmistakable. There was the alley. The flashing lights, the man clearly still, and then the officer stepping forward, reaching to his belt, and placing something near the man's hand. Gasps filled the room. The footage lasted only 12 seconds, but it changed everything. When it ended, the prosecutor turned back to the boy. Does that match what you saw? Yes, the boy said. Exactly. The defense attorney didn't cross-examine him this time. He sat down slowly, like the air had been let out of him. He knew there was nothing left to twist, nothing left to deny. But the most powerful moment came not from the lawyers or the video. It came from the boy himself. After a pause, he added, voice soft but firm, I didn't want to be here. I just didn't want anyone to forget what really happened. That's when the room truly fell still. Because it wasn't about drama. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about a kid who saw something wrong and chose to speak up, even when no one asked him to, even when it would have been easier to stay quiet. Later, during a recess, a veteran reporter who'd covered courtrooms for 30 years turned to a colleague and said, I've never seen a witness that young hold a room like that. Not with anger, not with fear, just truth. Back inside, the judge called for order, but the mood had shifted. The case was no longer just about procedure or protocol. It was about accountability, about whether the system could admit when it got something wrong, and whether a child's word could be enough to make it right. The boy returned to his seat. His mom reached for his hand and held it tight. No words were needed. They both knew something had broken open today. Not violently, not loudly, but deeply. Outside the courthouse, people gathered on the steps, talking in low voices. Some shook their heads. Others stood in silence, staring at the sky like they were trying to make sense of what they'd just witnessed. A few parents held their kids a little closer. Inside, the legal teams huddled. The prosecutor's team looked focused, energized. The defense looked like they were bracing for impact. And the officer? He didn't leave his seat. He just sat there, staring at the tabletop, his earlier confidence gone. For the first time, he looked small. The boy didn't gloat. Didn't smile. He just sat quietly watching the clock tick toward the next break, his mind already drifting back to ordinary things. Homework, his sister's soccer game, whether his library book was due tomorrow, because to him this wasn't about being a hero. It was about doing what felt right, and sometimes that's the most astonishing thing of all. As the afternoon wore on, the judge announced that new evidence would require additional review. The trial would continue, but the momentum had clearly turned. Charges that once seemed unlikely were now being seriously considered, not just for the use of force, but for what came after. For the cover-up, for the lie, and at the center of it all stood a 12-year-old who hadn't set out to change anything except to tell the truth. Later that evening, as he walked home with his mom under a sky streaked with orange and purple, a neighbor waved from across the street. "You did good today," she called out. He just nodded and kept walking. He didn't need praise. He didn't need attention. He just needed to know that what he saw mattered. And today, in a room full of adults who thought they had all the answers, a quiet boy with a steady hand and a clear memory had reminded them that sometimes the most powerful voice in the room is the one that speaks simply, honestly, and without fear, even if it's still growing. The trial didn't end that day. Court cases like this one rarely do. They stretch out over weeks, sometimes months, filled with motions, delays, and long stretches of waiting that feel like standing still. But something had already shifted, something deeper than verdicts or headlines. People started talking, not just in hushed courthouse hallways, but at dinner tables, school pickups, and community meetings. They talked about what it means to be believed, about who gets listened to and who gets ignored, and about how sometimes the clearest truth comes from the quietest voice. For the boy, life didn't suddenly become easy. There were still nights when he woke up thinking he heard sirens, still moments at school when a loud noise made his heart jump, but something inside him had settled. He wasn't carrying the weight alone anymore. His drawings were now part of an official case file. His words had been recorded, reviewed, and most importantly, taken seriously. That didn't erase what happened, but it made it matter. His mom noticed the change first. He started humming again while doing his homework. He laughed at his sister's silly jokes. He even signed up for the school art club, where he drew landscapes and cityscapes instead of alleyways and flashing lights. Not because he'd forgotten, but because he finally felt like he could look forward again. Months passed. The legal process moved slowly but steadily. The officer was charged not just for misconduct, but for lying under oath and tampering with evidence. It wasn't a flashy arrest or a dramatic courtroom confession. It was quiet, procedural, and real. The kind of justice that doesn't make movie trailers but changes lives all the same. When the final hearing came, the boy didn't have to testify again. His earlier statements, the security footage, and the inconsistencies in the official report were enough. The officer pleaded no contest. He lost his badge, his pension, and his place in the department. More importantly, the family of the man who died received something they hadn't expected: acknowledgement. Not just a settlement, but a public statement that what happened that night wasn't right, and that someone had finally been held accountable. The boy didn't attend the sentencing. He was at school, finishing a science project about how light bends through water, but his mom texted him a single word when it was over: done. That night they ordered pizza and watched a silly cartoon his sister loved. No speeches, no grand gestures, just a regular evening in a house that finally felt like it could breathe again. But the story didn't end there. A few weeks later, the boy got an invitation in the mail. It was from the city's youth council, a group that worked with local leaders on community safety and fairness. They wanted him to speak at their annual gathering. Not as a witness, not as a victim, but as someone who showed that young people see more than adults often give them credit for. He almost said no. Public speaking wasn't his thing. But his teacher, the one who first listened, told him, "You don't have to change the world. Just help others feel like they can speak up too." So he went. The room was full of students, parents, city officials, and even a few police officers. Not the kind from that night, but newer ones, younger ones, who wore their uniforms like a promise, not a shield. When it was his turn, he didn't give a big speech. He just said, "I didn't do anything special. I just told what I saw, and I learned that truth doesn't need to be loud to be important." Afterward, kids came up to him, not for autographs, but to ask questions. "Were you scared?" one asked. "What if no one believed you?" asked another. He answered honestly, "Yeah, I was scared. And I didn't know if anyone would listen, but I figured, if I didn't say something, who would?" That moment sparked something unexpected. A group of students started a See Something, Say Something club at school. Not about snitching, but about looking out for each other, noticing when something feels off and knowing it's okay to speak up. Teachers supported it. Even the principal joined the first meeting. Meanwhile, the legal aid group began offering workshops for kids and families about their rights and how to document what they see, safely, respectfully, and clearly. The boys' sketches were used, with permission, as examples of how observation can be a form of courage. He never became famous. There were no news vans parked outside his house, no book deals, no interviews on national TV. And that was fine. He didn't want fame. He just wanted things to be fair. One afternoon, while walking home from the library, he passed the alley where it all began. It looked different now, cleaner, quieter, with new streetlights and a community garden sprouting in the empty lot next door. He stopped for a moment, not out of fear, but out of quiet reflection. Then he kept walking. His little sister ran up beside him, holding 2 ice cream cones she'd bought with her allowance. "One's for you," she said, handing him the messier one. "I tried not to drip, but it's melting." He laughed and took it. "Thanks." They walked home side by side, licking their cones, talking about nothing important, what movie to watch, whether their cat would ever stop knocking things off the counter, if summer would ever get here. And in that ordinary moment, something beautiful happened. Normalcy returned, not the kind that pretends nothing happened, but the kind that says, we went through something hard, and we're still here. Months later, at a small community awards night held in the high school gym, the boy was called to the stage, not for being a hero, the organizer made sure to say, but for showing us that honesty doesn't have an age limit. The applause wasn't thunderous. It was warm, real, the kind that comes from people who understand what it cost and what it gave. As he walked back to his seat, his mom wiped a tear away without making a sound. His sister beamed like she'd won the award herself. And the boy? He just smiled, tucked his hands in his pockets, and thought about how good it felt to finally sleep through the night. Because in the end, the story wasn't really about a courtroom or a pointing finger or even a single act of courage. It was about what happens after, how one moment of truth can ripple outward, quietly changing hearts, systems, and neighborhoods, one small act at a time. And sometimes the most astonishing thing isn't what a child says in court. It's what the world becomes when we finally choose to listen.